1. This is the beginning of the Development and Industrialization Unit, Unit 6. And the first key issue, we're just looking at some basic key terms in economic development. And so this is how Rubenstein's textbook is set up with all these different terms. So we'll go through specifically why does development vary among countries. The learning goal is that students be able to define and identify HDI indicators, those are Human Development Index indicators, explain and apply how these are used in determining the development levels of countries. And we will be doing this. And here is the list of key terms. There's a few things in here that are not in your book that I will go over. So development is the process of improving the material conditions of people through knowledge and technology. Basically, this is just looking at the livelihood, the standard of living, how healthy and prosperous people are in their country. And this is a continuous process. So it's ongoing, and countries are at different levels of development at different times. And geographers are interested in thinking about where in the world is there high levels of development, like MDCs, where are there low levels of development, like LDCs, and why? Why are the regions at different levels? Why do highly developed regions, why are they highly developed regions, and why are they high versus low? How do they get there first? And just thinking about how do highly developed regions, how can they stay highly developed, and how can low developed regions get to be more highly developed. Now, not part of the book, but I think helpful in understanding in economic development is the basic economic systems. And these are planned. Let me just get my marker here, my pen. So planned or command system. This is often called socialism, and an extreme form of socialism would be communism. And basically a planned or a command economic system is where it is controlled, the economy is controlled by society, for the mutual good of society, whether this is controlled by government often, which it is, or maybe there's socialistic systems within a society, so maybe a government, or sorry, not a government, but a corporation is owned by the people who work there. So it's more looking at cooperative ownership, community ownership, whether it's the entire society through the ownership of, as government controls it, as it's a democratic society. And this is versus private ownership, which is something you'd more likely see in capitalism. Decisions about what to produce and the price of the products is determined by the society, the group, whether that's government, who is run by the democracy, the citizens, or whatnot. Right, so decisions, that's why it's kind of like planned or command, because somebody is making those decisions. A market or free economic system, often referred to as capitalism, this is where the market, the market determines what to produce, and the price is based on the supply and demand of the market. This is not regulated by, quote, the group, which is maybe it's society or government. And the market is really the everybody who is consumers, and almost, the population of consumers, and as collectively as the consumers are considered the market. And it's almost like the market is an entity, a being in itself, and as consumers collectively demand for more products, then corporations and businesses will meet that demand by providing a supply, and the inequality of the supply and demand will regulate the prices. If the supply is too high and the demand is not high enough, then the prices will probably lower until the demand meets the supply. If the supply is low and the demand is high, then often the price is going to be high because there's not quite enough, and people will compete to buy that and will be willing to pay a higher price. So those are essentially what those economic systems are. Mixed here is a mixture of both of these systems, mix of planned and market. And this is really the most common in the world. So really no country or very few countries have a strictly command or planned society. Maybe the exception of North Korea. But even China has a mix of planned and market, where they are a communist state, but they allow for a market economy of people who are investors from the United States, capitalistic corporations that are investing in building factories in China, because China recognizes the potential for making profit and money using this mix of planned and market. So most of the world, including the United States, we've got government regulates the market, will subsidize agriculture, and so in that way it's kind of a control or command, to make sure that farmers continue to farm and get enough money for their prices, for their products when the prices drop. So most countries do have a mixture of planned and market. Subsistence economic system would be those communities that would rely on natural resources just for their basic needs, be a barter system. They're trading goods for other goods. Really, there's no currency. So this is like what you would have hunter-gatherer societies, or subsistence farming, pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence, and whatnot. All right, we'll move on. I just thought this was really interesting. It might be difficult to read, but so I was looking up at Wikipedia and just what they had to say about socialism and capitalism. So I'm just going to read this because I thought it was insightful. So socialists generally argue that capitalism concentrates power and wealth within a small segment of society that controls the means of production and derives its wealth through economic exploitation. This creates unequal social relations, which fails to provide opportunities for every individual to maximize their potential, and does not utilize available technology and resources to their maximum potential in the interest of the public. So a socialist criticism of capitalism would be that there is a wealthy elite that kind of controls and exploits laborers to their benefit, and does not provide, and this promotes an inequality of wealthy and poor, and the poor do not have the same availability to maximize their potential as the wealthy do. And here's Albert Einstein here, and his criticism of capitalism. He said, quoted, 1949, this quote's from, "The economic anarchy of capitalistic society as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of the evil. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion," hence planned economy. "A planned economy which adjusts production to the needs of the community, would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work, and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. The education of the individual, in addition to promoting his own innate abilities, would attempt to develop in him a sense of responsibility for his fellow man in place of the glorification of power and success in our present society. Alright, then looking here at capitalism. Capitalism generally refers to economic system where the means of production are largely or entirely privately owned, and operated for a profit, structured on the process of capital accumulation. Capital in this meaning wealth, money, or goods. In general, investments, distribution, income, and prices are determined by the markets. There are various different variations of capitalism with different relationships to markets. In laissez-faire and free market variations of capitalism, markets are utilized most extensively with minimal or no state intervention and regulation over prices and the supply of goods and services. In interventionist welfare capitalism and mixed economies, markets continue to play a dominant role but are regulated in some extent by government in order to correct market failures or to promote social welfare. In state capitalistic systems, markets are relied upon the least, with the state relying heavily on either indirect economic planning and or state-owned enterprises to accumulate capital. It might be kind of like China. And the second one kind of like maybe the United States. Capitalism has been dominant in the Western world since the end of feudalism, but most feel that the term mixed economies more precisely describes most contemporary economies due to their containing both private-owned and state-owned enterprises. In capitalism, prices determine the demand-supply scale. For example, higher demand for certain goods and services lead to higher prices, and lower demand for certain goods lead to lower prices. I hope that was helpful. Alright, on to Human Development Index. The definition is, and purpose, is that Human Development Index indicates the level of development for each country. And it uses data from 3 different areas: economic, social, and demographic. And this data is calculated to get a number between 0 and 1. And numbers that are close to 1 are going to be highly developed countries. And we'll talk about these as core countries. We've kind of talked about this a little bit before. Norway being a very high developed core country with the HDI of 0.963. And low HDI would be numbers that are close to 0, and we talked about these countries as being periphery countries. Niger in Africa would have a very low HDI of 0.281. So we're going to look at the different areas of Human Development Index. So the first one we'll look at is economic. So the economic indicator of development used in HDI correlates to the GDP. We'll look at it specifically, GDP per capita, but GDP is the total value of outputs of goods and services produced in a country. This is gross, and I didn't have it here, sorry, gross domestic product. And I'll type that out. Gross meaning not like as in, ooh, gross, but as in the total value. Gross as in the whole thing. Domestic means in the country. So you've got goods and services that are in the country, domestic product. All right, and then gross national product, which is the second one here, that is, gross national product is the total value of goods and services produced by the citizens and corporations that are from that country, of a country in a year. And this could be inside or outside a country. And the focus is national. And national is more like the people. So it makes up, the nation is the people who live in that country. Right? So the people that might live in Saudi Arabia because they're working in the oil fields there, but they're still a United States citizen, maybe they're working for Shell Corporation, and so they're working as a citizen of the United States, but they're living in Saudi Arabia. The money that they earn and the money that the corporation earns is considered part of this gross national product. All right, then gross national income right here is the monetary worth, the whole income of what is produced within a country, plus the income received from investments and aid outside the country too. Investment and aid, money that be given to the country to help it outside. So it's the total amount of money, not just what's in a country, but all the money that is earned for the country, whether it's in the country or outside the country. So including investments. So maybe I invest in a business that's Chinese, and that Chinese business, not a factory, a United States factory in China, but actual Chinese business. And when that Chinese business earns money, as an investor, I earn some money on that investment. And so that money that I earn as an investment gets counted as a part of this gross national income. So all of these are, values of, how much money a country earns. The gross national income by far is going to include everything, so it will be the largest amount. Now, PPP, or purchasing power parity, this is not in your book. This is often used to determine when you're comparing two different countries and trying to look at how far their money can go in purchasing the same kinds of items in one country versus another country. So it kind of helps to level out, how powerful your money is. For example, in India, maybe it would cost, a certain amount of money, maybe about $1 to buy a loaf of bread in their country with the value of their money and their power of their money in India. And in maybe Great Britain, maybe it would a loaf of bread would cost maybe about $3. So you're looking at, they might get more money in England, but things cost a little bit more. And in India, they might not get as much money, but things aren't quite as expensive. So it kind of just helps to level out, how much money, how far your money can go, how much power your money has to buy things. And this little map down here, is purple map, looks at the purchasing power parity per capita, which is we're looking here, per capita is then dividing it by the total population. So it's more of like an average. So you can see the darker the purple, the more purchasing power individuals have to buy more in those countries compared to other countries. So per capita is the total amount of money or value, GDP or GNI or GNP, whatever you put up here, divided by the total population. And what this does is basically looks at the average income. Now, this is helpful, and this is what is used, GDP per capita. This is what is used for the economic indicator for HDI. The problem with this is that it doesn't show you the wealth distribution. It doesn't show you, what percentage of the people are very, very wealthy, what percentage of people are poor, are most everybody equal in their wealth, or do you have a high inequality gap? Maybe you have 10% wealthy, and then you have 90% very, very poor. So it doesn't show you the inequality and where that wealth is distributed and how that wealth is distributed amongst the population. Usually in a very unequal society economically, that's usually not seen as a inequality is also an indicator of development, and the more unequal, the less everybody feels happy and has a higher standard of living for everybody. So usually inequality is not good and would draw an HDI number down lower towards 0. Alright, so let's continue looking a little bit more about economic. So here we have the GDP per capita. This is the map, and this is looking at the overall GDP per capita. So highly developed, you can see with the dark, highly developed countries have 20,000 per person on average and above. So you can see, North America, Canada, United States, Western Europe, New Zealand, and Australia. And then countries that are very, very poor, 1,000 to maybe 5,000 on average per person. You can see largely in sub-Saharan Africa here. Here we've got Afghanistan, very poor, and then other countries here in South Asia. You've got India, and a few countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. Here we've got Mongolia up here. Right, so usually less than 5,000 GDP per capita is going to be like a LDC, and greater than 20,000 would be like an MDC. Now here's another bit of information I want you to understand. You might see this formal economy or informal economy. And the formal economy is what is documented, what is legal, what is on the books, what's documented by the government and the IRS, and what you have to pay taxes on. So formal economy is what is documented, what is recorded. Informal here is basically not what is not counted. It's uncounted. It's not documented, or it could be illegal. It doesn't have to be illegal to be informal. And these transactions, this economic, informal economy, is things like would include, illegal drug trade. Could include selling tomatoes from your backyard. It's not illegal to do that, but you're not documenting it. You're not recording it. You're not telling the IRS that you made so much money in selling tomatoes out of your backyard. This includes maybe a lemonade stand and selling lemonade. It could include people who are waiters or waitresses and they collect tips, and they might not claim all those tips to the IRS. So the economy really includes every bit of monetary transaction, buying and selling of goods and services, whether it's formal or it's informal. And in some societies, especially in countries where maybe there's a lot of things being sold on the black market. When I mean that would be like illegal, maybe in areas that are kind of poor and people can't get the things that they need at a store, from a vendor, but they might just find somebody on the street who's selling, radio or batteries or meat, whatever it is, if it's not in an official form, an official store, official company, or something like that. So I just want you to be aware of formal and informal economy. This was interesting. This is looking at the map of the United States as GDP and comparing each of these states with a particular country, and the state has the same GDP as that particular country. So the United States is very, very wealthy, the wealthiest country in the world. And I got this map here at the dailybail.com, and this is dated 2010. So just to look at a few interesting things, here down in Florida, the amount of money that state of Florida makes is the same amount of money that South Korea makes. Canada makes the same amount of money that the state of Texas. So I just thought this was kind of an interesting comparison at looking at how much money each state makes compared to these different countries. Another economic indicator that actually is very useful in determining the development level of a country is looking at the different types of jobs. And these jobs are divided into what they're called sector. Primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector. And then under tertiary sector there are two kind of subsectors. Quaternary, like number 4, and quinary, like number 5. So primary sector, this is where you're getting something out of the earth, extracting raw materials. This is like agriculture. You're farming, you're getting stuff out of something out of the earth, you're farming, or you're fishing, getting something out of the ocean. You're forestry, so you're chopping down trees, you're mining. So all these things are primary sector jobs, getting something out of the earth, raw materials. Secondary sector jobs is now you take those raw materials and you make something with them. So this is like industry, this is manufacturing. You are making something, like making a car, making a ship, or making a bottle of beer, making some clothing. All this is secondary. Tertiary sector is basically services. You're providing a service to population. You're educating them, you're maybe cutting somebody's hair, you're operating on somebody, you are giving legal advice, and so forth. So these are tertiary sectors providing service. And then under that tertiary sector, you've got different levels of tertiary sector. So very, very simple, less educated, maybe like a hairstylist or somebody who works as a bank teller, that would be considered a tertiary sector. But something a little bit more, needing more education, intellectual activity would be your quaternary sector. So you need a little bit more education to qualify for that. And then the quinary sector needs that higher level of education, but it also includes high levels of decision making too. So somebody who is in a CEO, chief executive officer of a big corporation, and they're making decisions, or top management executives, or the President of the United States, or the President of the university, they have high levels of education, but they also are they're decision makers. So in class, I'll have you look at all of these different types of jobs and maybe a few more, and try to place them in the different economic, the different job sectors. What is helpful to determine what type of development a country is at, you can actually look at the mix of job sectors. So if you look here at this graph and you see MDCs here, over time, 1820 here, and today, 2000, MDCs have a very low percentage of primary sector jobs, so a very low percentage of people who are farmers or who are fishermen or who are miners. And you can see here that tertiary in today's world has a very high percentage of tertiary jobs. So you can see it's almost 80% or maybe even higher. So very low percentage of primary sector jobs and very high tertiary. And then kind of in the middle for your secondary jobs through manufacturing. And then in LDC here, you see over time they still have a very high primary percentage of jobs in primary. So you have high percentage of people who are farmers or fishermen or miners. And then you have a very low tertiary and low secondary. Maybe a little bit rising secondary as a country is becoming more industrialized and having more factories. That would be like manufacturing. So you can look at this and determine the development level by looking at a country. If it has a very high primary percentage of their jobs in primary sector jobs, you can basically determine that it's an LDC. Or if you see a very high percentage of tertiary sector jobs, then you can determine that probably an MDC. Right. Also part of economic development is looking at the productivity and value added. So productivity has to do with how much labor is needed to make the product. If you need lots and lots of labor, if it's very labor intensive to make the product, then you put a lot of cost into making that product. And you'd have to say that it took a lot of labor, so you weren't very productive. A lot of cost into labor, and so you can say that you weren't very productive. It was very highly labor intensive. Now, if you make a product making with machines, and that would be capital intensive, then you could say you're much more productive at making that item. Right? So you're looking really at how labor intensive. The more labor intensive it is, the less productive you are. So if you can use machines instead, you can be a lot more productive. Value added has to do with adding value to the raw materials, the raw materials that are used to make that product. So if you make something, if you make it and it's more complicated, complex, and you don't just have the raw materials. If you make something that's more complex, you can say you are adding value to it. Right? The more complicated, the more complex something is, like a car or a computer, it has a very high value added. It's a very high value added product. Right? If you don't do anything, if you just get a fish out of the ocean and it's just a fish, it's the raw materials and you haven't added anything, it's a very low value added. But once you take that fish and you chop it up and take the bones out and you can it, now you've added value and it becomes a more valuable product because you've added something to it. So you can actually sell it for a higher profit if you add value to it than if you just take the raw material. Right? So when you look at productivity, comparing this with MDCs and LDCs, MDCs usually have very high productivity in making their products because they usually use capital intensive means. It means they use a lot of machinery. And so they're very productive in making their products. Also, MDCs typically make things that are a lot more complicated. They make things like computers, or they make things like cell phones, or highly complicated machines that maybe surgeons might use on a very specific, operation. So they're not. MDCs are not just taking the raw materials and selling the raw materials. They're taking the raw materials like different kinds of metal and plastics and using energy and making something out of it. They have very high value-added products, and they're using machinery to make them, so they're very highly productive, using their high productivity because they're less labor-intensive. On the other hand, LDCs tend to make their products with either very simple machinery or they use a lot of people power, and so the productivity is much lower. And often LDCs will sell their raw materials, or sell their agricultural products, or their fish, or the things that they get out of the ground that they mine, maybe diamonds or cobalt or something like that. When they sell those resources, those raw materials, they do not put any value into it. They haven't complicated it, haven't made it more complex. And so because they just sell their raw materials, they don't get a lot of profit from that. It's less profit. Maybe they'll make some simple things that have, like a t-shirt versus a computer. A t-shirt has value added, but very, very little value. T-shirts are not very complicated. I should maybe compare a t-shirt with a wedding dress, maybe. A wedding dress is much more complicated, or a tuxedo, much more complicated than a t-shirt. So that's typical what you see difference in MDCs and LDCs. Let's move on. All right, raw materials. Now, raw materials are needed for development to happen. Development needs raw materials and energy. But you don't have to actually have it in your country. You can purchase raw materials and purchase energy, but you do need raw materials and energy to develop. And having raw materials and energy definitely is a good indicator that the potential is there right here. So availability of these two resources is a measure of a country's potential, but not actual. Just because you can have countries like Japan or Singapore or Switzerland, they don't have these resources, but they can get them. So they can trade them with something that they do have, trade it with another country, and get these things so they can develop. When you look at United Kingdom, which was really the first country to develop, they were the first ones to go through their Industrial Revolution, they were able to develop because they had this abundant coal and iron ore resource. And they used that in factories, and they were able to make things in their factories. So they were the first to develop. And they'd make all sorts of kinds of things, cloth and machinery and stuff like that. Now, when the UK was starting to run out of their coal and iron ore, they went looking elsewhere to get those raw materials, especially to Africa and to Asia. And they basically took those raw materials from those regions to use in their factories. And eventually, United Kingdom colonized Africa, large parts of Africa and Asia, particularly India and Asia. And because of that, and constantly taking those raw materials from these countries, it slowed the development of Africa and Asia. So you could say that United Kingdom, because it was the first, it was able to develop, and it exploited the other regions, Africa and Asia, and so Africa and Asia's development was much slower and happened much later because those raw materials were being taken from them and used elsewhere for the advantage of the United Kingdom. Still today, especially in places like Africa, they still export their raw materials to MDCs and then import those finished goods, right? Finished goods are things that have been value has been added to it because they're more complicated. Now, if Africa could, instead of exporting its raw materials, make things with those raw materials and industrialize and have factories and make these things and sell these value-added products to other places, then that would help Africa tremendously to develop. They would get more profit because of selling higher value-added products. All right, consumer goods. This is also an indicator of, economic indicator of, development. So when you are very wealthy and people have lots of money, then people can buy stuff. And the kinds of stuff that people like to buy are from these two categories. Transportation, they want cars, and communication, they want cell phones and computers. So MDCs usually have lots of money for consumers to buy. And so you can see down here, this is looking at vehicles per capita. So the darker the color, the more cars per person a person has. So you can see the wealthy areas are Canada, United States, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And then other areas where they don't have as many cars per person. You can see here in Africa, India, Pakistan, they don't have a lot of people that can have cars. They have a very low number. And over here, this is personal computers per capita. So this is 865, with Sweden having the most personal computers per person. And then you can see, down here, the green, or no data with the white, you see people that don't have a lot of computers. So LDCs, consumer goods aren't essential for daily life. People are more just surviving, living on, $1 or $2 a day. And those people, those who do buy these different consumer products, mostly are going to live in the urban areas. They're mostly going to be the wealthy parts of, wealthy sector of society. So this is another indicator of economic development too. What percentage of their society can afford these consumer goods, mostly along the lines of transportation. They want cars and communication, telephones and computers. Interesting, in China, here, China's got a growing middle class here, and people are having more and more money, and what are they buying? They're buying cars, lots of cars, and so there is a traffic jam that lasted 9 days. They don't have the infrastructure to the roads and stuff to deal with all the cars that people are buying. And so the fact that there's more and more people having cars, that's an indicator that China is becoming a wealthier society and growing and becoming more developed. All right, let's go on to social indicators. Social has to do more with people, and the two that we're looking at is education and literacy, and then we'll also look at health. So education actually has two ways of measuring development. The first one is quantity. Let me just first say that the percent of GDP, right, gross domestic product, spent on education is really about the same for MDCs and LDCs. They spend about the same percentage on education. The only difference would be that MDCs make a lot more money. All right, they have a higher GDP overall than LDCs. So even though it's about the same percent, more money is being spent on education in MDCs. All right, so there are two different measures of education. One is quantity, which is think about number. Right, this is number. Whoa, it's a big number sign. And quality is more like, the quality of the education. So we're going to look at number, and actually the number is what is used in the HDI number. Average number of school years, all right, a student attends. So think number of school years, right, to help you remember. So average number of school years in MDC would be 10 years. If you think about United States, if you go from kindergarten to 12th grade, that's 13 years. And then some people, go on to college. Maybe add 4 more years, be 17 years. But overall, average would be 10 years. LDCs, 2 years. Very little. So you can see here, the dark is purple. Dark is 15 years and above. This is the next one, which is quality. Okay, so quality. All right, being a teacher, I know that if I have fewer students in my class, I can give them a better quality education. So the quality is a measure of the student-to-teacher ratio. So in LDCs, look here, a very, very low number here, like the tan. This is above 40 students per class. So you imagine having 40 kids in a class. You don't have such a high-quality education. It's very difficult for the teacher to give one-on-one attention. and it gets kind of rowdy. So you have a very high number of students in your classroom. That's going to be a low-quality classroom. As compared to 15 and below, you see United States, you see Western Europe, you see Saudi Arabia there. 15 on average. Now, we've got some classes that are higher, some classes are lower because maybe it's, for special needs or something like that. But on average, 15 students and below. So you can have a lot higher quality education you have fewer kids per teacher. So there's two measurements of quality. One is student-teacher, and the other is literacy rate. Literacy rate is the percentage of people 15 years and older who can read and write. Usually MDCs have like 90% and above, and LDCs have less than 60%. And often, interesting too, in LDCs, there's an inequality too. Inequality between male and female. Often in LDCs, there's a higher male literacy rate than female, which means that more men are going to school and girls are not able to go to school. So you see less girls going to school. So when you see this inequality between males and female, that also would be an indicator of an LDC. All right, let's move on. Health and welfare. All right, so as far as healthcare, MDCs spend more than 8% of their GDP on healthcare. And they do have a higher GDP, so that's going to be more money spent on their healthcare. Overall, everybody's spending that much money. LDCs have less than 6% on healthcare, and again, they have a lower GDP, so overall, less money is being spent on healthcare. So MDCs here, they have, better diet, more calories, and more protein. Usually, individuals pay less than 30% of their healthcare costs. Most MDCs, actually, United States pays, individuals pay, 50% higher. 50% of their healthcare costs come out of individual pockets. It's because there's not a universal healthcare system in the United States like a lot of other industrialized nations, a lot of MDCs like in Europe, Australia. The government actually pays for all of their healthcare costs, so individuals pay usually less than 30%, even less than 20% out-of-pocket costs. The wealthy, there is wealth used to help protect people who can't work, so we have like a government, we call it a government safety net, so people who are too old or who have disability and they can't work, the government usually helps to pay for them, so that's like we have Social Security or Medicare or things like that. Usually there are a lot more doctors per person in an MDC too. LDCs, often their diet doesn't have enough calories or maybe don't have enough protein. Individuals pay a lot more money out of pocket for their health care, 50% more, often like the United States. There is no government safety net, so people who cannot work, who are too old or disabled, they have to rely on their family members to take care of them. And this is just looking at the health expenditure as a percent of the GDP. So, more than 8% usually is MDCs and less than 6% for LDCs. So here you got 10% and above, you can see a lot of money spent in healthcare. And then below 4%, you can see here, not as much money spent on healthcare. All right, to move on to the last little bit was demographic indicators. And we've talked about this when we did chapter 2. Life expectancy usually is very high, 70 and older in MDCs, and tends to be 60s or less in LDCs. So people tend to live longer, and so life expectancy definitely is an indicator of development. We have a low dependency ratio usually, with not a lot of kids, and a high dependency ratio with high youth dependency ratio. Infant mortality rate, usually it's much lower, so more babies are surviving their first year. Not much different with LDCs though, but still a little bit lower. Natural increase rate, right? We talked about that. Crude birth rate minus crude death rate. This is almost a 0% NIR, which would be typical of an MDC in stage 4, approaching stage 5. And then LDCs would be much more rapid growth, 1.5 average, could be higher too. And then looking at crude birth rate, average number of babies being born per 1,000, that's maybe about 11, it's typical of MDC, maybe about 24 or higher for an LDC. So looking at the Human Development Index, there are 4 indicators that are used. One is the economic, this is your GDP per capita. This is going to be important because you're going to be using this information using the U.S. Census or United Nations website. The social is literacy rate here, right? And the amount of education. So this is your quantity. This is your average number of years the person is in school, right? And the last one is demographic. We're going to look at life expectancy. So typically, just kind of ballpark, a high HDI number, like something you would consider an MDC, would be about, greater than about 0.8. So here you have the dark blue here and have 0.796. So you can see these are highly developed countries. And you can see Chile and Argentina down there. Low would be kind of, about less than 0.6, kind of average. I kind of, split this in the middle here. And then the middle, somewhere between 0.6 and 0.8. So I just kind of rounded those numbers, and you can see kind of how the breakdown is. And these will be important, and you will be using these to determine the development levels of countries, looking at data. But I also want you to see that job sectors is another very useful indicator for looking at development. So we talked about a high HDI. High would have a very high tertiary job sector, right? High number of population working in service jobs and a very low percentage of the population working in like agriculture and fishing and farming, stuff like that. And then a low HDI, LDC, is going to have a very high percentage of their population working in agriculture, fishing and forestry and stuff like that, and a much lower tertiary sector job. Right, so that is the end of Chapter 9, Key Issue 1.